Hey guys, welcome to May's Q&A about the quality of life in Japan or in Tokyo. And it's actually June right now when I'm recording this, but the questions are from May. So that's why the problem or the difference with the months. Okay, so let's get into the first question. And this is from Mix. And it says, Hi Greg. Hey. From your experience, would you say the income distribution in Japan is much more equal than other developed countries? For example, is the proportion of middle class citizens bigger than the rich and poor compared to, let's say, Canada? Also, is it easier to ascend in social status in terms of quality of life in Japan versus other developed countries? Thanks. That's a very good question, and it's something that I've asked myself quite a lot over the years. And there are different ways to kind of measure the quality of life and the cost of living and whether or not people within the society are equal. One of them is like the Gini coefficient. And if it's 100%, that means it's totally unequal society, right? Like one dude or one lady has all the money at the top, right? Whereas if it's completely equal, if you have 10 people and $100, everyone has $10 versus that one person who has $100 and the rest have zero, right? In the completely unequal society. So when I looked up the stats, Canada, for example, has a Gini coefficient of 34, and this is for 2013. Whereas Japan, it said it was 32.1 in 2008. And I've looked at different data points provided by different people, and they seem they're roughly in the 30 to 35 range, both Canada and Japan. And sometimes Japan has gone above Canada, and sometimes Canada's gone above Japan. So they appear fairly equal as of that for that measure. All right, I'm back. Construction was a bit noisy, so I had to put the pause on things for a little bit. I was talking about income inequality, and there's a ratio out here of our percentage, kind of, or multiplication. Yeah, I think that's the word I was looking for, multiplication of the people on the bottom 20%. How much more does the people at the top 20% make? So in Canada, that number is 5.5. So if somebody in the bottom made $1,000 a year, the people in the top would on average, top 20% would on average make 5,500. Well, in Japan, it's 3.4, so that would be 1,000 versus 3,400. And in the United States, it's around the 10-ish mark, so 1,000 versus 10,000. So obviously a lot less equal in the United States according to this type of ratio. So what I did want to talk about though is what is it like for people kind of on the lower end? Like what do I see on the ground? Because I think the problem with a lot of these ratios are just looking at straight dollar numbers is you don't know what you're getting in that life. And what do I mean by this is like, okay, is healthcare included in that? Are there parks close by? Like, is your education paid for? You have to pay extras for that. Just pay for transportation, that type of stuff. So in Japan, the daycare kindergarten system, the one that's either public or kind of like semi-public, or that's the costs are sponsored or subsidized by the government. If you're at the lower end of the level, and you don't have to be like if you're in that bottom 20%, your daycare is probably pretty free-ish and kindergarten in Japan. It depends on the municipality you're in and whatnot and the availability of spots. But where I am, we didn't pay that much for Shin when he was going through the system. It was like $50 a month or something, like so little that it's just you know not a big consideration. Whereas in Canada, we were paying close to $1,000 a month, so a huge difference. Public housing, there is public housing available for people, and how that system works is you get like a lottery ticket kind of thing. So if the poorer you are, or if you're a single mother with kids, if you have a disability, you kind of get more tickets. So some, like say, a single mother with a disability with two kids, they might get like 100 points versus a 40-year-old male or somebody like myself who's educated but single and has good prospects of getting a job. I'd get like one ticket. So the chance of me actually getting a spot is really low. So that's how public housing works. There's not enough spaces for everyone. So you have to go to other types of housing if you can't get in. And I think the thing about Tokyo is that you can get smaller spaces even in popular areas for not too expensive. So with $1,000, you can pretty much live anywhere. You might be living in you know, a bachelor suite, a small little one, but you can get that in some of the most popular places in Tokyo. Whereas that's just simply not possible in a city like Vancouver or Toronto, or I'm pretty sure like Los Angeles or New York. You just can't get into the main areas where you don't need to own a car. In Tokyo, you can get to places where you don't need to own a car, and thus your transportation costs are lower as well. So there's that. Then there's the after school care. So once you're in school, school's free. There's school lunches, which you're required to pay something around $2 a month. But if you make not enough money, the city will subsidize you. So it also kind of be free-ish. Healthcare, again, that's it's free for kids. Like that's this dental, this is prescriptions, this is eye care as well. It's all included. You don't have to pay anything for that. Of course, your taxes pay for it, but you don't have to put that out of pocket. And your company would pay for your healthcare. And there's also maximums on healthcare costs. So if you don't make so much money, there's only a certain amount of money a month that you'd have to pay. So I'm kind of making up this number, but I know I've seen it before. If you're pretty low income, you can't end up paying more than $1,000 a month for like some pretty serious healthcare cost because it'll max out pretty fast. So when you take all those big costs into consideration, education, healthcare, transportation, housing, when you're poor in Japan, you can get away with a fairly decent level or bare minimum. So I think even if your income might seem low, you can still get a lot for that low amount of income. So in Canada, I would generally agree that there's a lot of support for people who are less wealthy in Canada as well. But I think in Japan, there's just a bit more, is my feeling. Now, how do you get out of that, poverty cycle and move up? That's kind of like discussion for another video. Okay, so let me tackle on the next questions. I don't think they're as complicated as that one. So Grace, you're asking, how hard is it to make friends who speak English? This one is kind of tough for me to answer without any bias because I have kind of a decent enough social media following that are people kind of ask me to meet up and speak English, and it's probably easier for me to meet people to speak English with in Tokyo than just another person. That being said, before I started YouTube, before I even got like a decent size, maybe for 3 years, I didn't have that kind of say advantage. And there's it's Tokyo, right? So there's a lot of meetup groups you can go to speak English with people. And whether it's you want to talk with foreigners, there's definitely places you can meet up with them, like meetup.com, for example. There's probably some Reddit communities as well you could use. Then there's just local people who want to learn English, and you could probably speak English with them as well. So it's not that hard, and I think the more people you meet, the easier it is to become friends. So I think if you're worried about not being able to have friends who speak English in Tokyo, I don't think that's your issue. I think your issue, at least for me, is that my language ability in Japanese is not good enough that I can have meaningful relationships with Japanese friends, like deep relationships, because I just can't communicate at that level in Japanese. Okay, Kani, how is the entertainment in Japan? As relevant to you specifically as a family, couple, and adult male. I think entertainment in Tokyo is great, as far as I'm concerned. There is just so much to do, and so much so that after being here for 5 years and having visited 6 times before we even moved here, I still have things I've never done completely new. On the other hand, like say in Vancouver, where I used to live, you end up doing the same thing over and over because you kind of like run through your list of like the stuff to do. I think the more of the thing in Tokyo is if you have to figure out when you're looking at these new things, is it worth the effort to go out and do it? Um, the thing I like about Tokyo is they have so many festivals going on that, and different festivals, you can kind of like every single weekend you can go to a different area and experience a different festival if you really wanted to. There's also a lot of great, relatively cheap or free museums and zoos and kind of activities that you can do either with a couple, with your family, or by yourself. Nightlife, I don't do much nightlife as a male, but there's I hear about a lot of like different things that people can do. So I think you be hard pressed to be bored in Tokyo if you're actually trying to go out and do stuff. So I think the entertainment is pretty darn up there for city type activities. Now, if you're talking about like hiking in mountains, swimming in the ocean, canoeing across a lake, like outdoor activities, you can do that in Tokyo. It just requires more effort. Like you have to maybe, travel for a couple hours to get to those things. Whereas if you lived in a more rural area, maybe it's only a 30-minute type of thing. But the nice thing is that you don't necessarily need to own any special equipment. In fact, I would say you don't need to own anything at all for the most part. You can always rent stuff, whether it's hiking gear, fishing gear, like boats, and just anything you want. You can like barbecues, you can kind of rent it. So that makes it quite handy. Whereas in Canada, I think more of the culture is you own it, right? You want to go camping, you own your tent, you own your sleeping bags. You want to go for a barbecue, you own the barbecue, that sort of thing. Okay, why? You had a lot of questions, but I'm just going to focus on one of them. And you asked, what are the most common beverages to order when dining in Japan? And how does this compare with the rest of the world? Example, coffee. What is the coffee culture like in Japan? Do they offer the same coffee menu as they do in the West? Um, so let me bring it back from coffee for a second. Green tea and or some type of non-sweetened tea, like maybe barley tea, is the standard in Japanese restaurants. So you can almost always get it for free at a Japanese restaurant. Water as well. Now, when you're talking about things like pop, it's just not as common to have, or they won't be included in combos as much. So it just won't, Coke as part of your meal. You have to order it separately and pay an extra cost. Your portion sizes of all your drinks will be a lot smaller in Japan on average than in, like, say, North America. And beer, you can actually, in some ways, I would say beer is almost a little bit more popular to have with meals than in Canada, even, or just in different places. I'll see people having drinks, whereas, like if you go to a ramen shop, for example, people might have a beer, or go to a family restaurant, people might have a beer, and you can do. Canada, I think, is more restrictive. Depends, I guess, on your province where you're located, but they're more restrictive on the alcohol you can have at certain types of establishments. Whereas Japan, I think it's a little more open. Now, coffee. Coffee, I don't think the culture is quite as serious or into the coffee cafe culture as, for example, the West Coast where I was from. So like Vancouver or, down south, Seattle. I know there are places where they do like serious coffee, like drip coffees and roast their own stuff and whatnot in Tokyo. But like for your average coffee, from what I hear from people, it's lower than what you'd find out on the West Coast in Canada. Yeah. Okay, so, all right. So I just want to let you guys know this video was supported by my peeps on Patreon. Why did I say peeps? I don't know. My patrons on Patreon, and they provide monthly financial support so I can make kind of like the mini documentaries that require more time and may not necessarily get a lot of views. And so it helps me focus all my energies on making videos. So thank you so much for all those people on Patreon for supporting. Now this Q&A, I used to make this private, but I've decided to make it public a few months ago because, part of, we talked about income and inequality, right? Quality of life. And I didn't have that much money for good chunks of my life. I can never support somebody like myself on Patreon. So, but, I want to reach a lot of people, and I think it's kind of, unfair if you don't have money that you can't, get all the content. So that's why I've kind of made this bargain, I guess, is that for people on Patreon, I'll give them or you first dibs on asking a question, and I'll make sure I answer your questions. And then if I have extra time, I will put the call out on social media to see if anybody has questions, and then I'll release it publicly so everyone can see. So that's how it's working. Um, okay, so David Wilson, you asked renting versus buying. So personally, I bought, and it was a simple financial reason. Is if like because we plan on owning the house for a good chunk of time. I don't plan on selling, even if we move back to Canada. So if you're planning on owning long term, the buying equation I think is fairly decent in Japan because the rate right now is like around 1% is what we pay on the mortgage, and it's a 35-year mortgage, which is quite long. So for our house, it's roughly rough numbers around $1,000 a month is what we pay for the mortgage. So the rent, we used to pay more in rent than that, like 1,200 US is what you used to pay for our rent. So it just financially, it kind of is cheaper, to have your mortgage. And actually, tax wise, for the first 10 years, you get an extra tax credit for owning a home. So I'd say it's definitely cheaper. Now, as time goes on, maybe once you start having to do repairs and whatnot, it might be more expensive. But I think overall it's a tax savings. And then you have the benefit of owning your own home, so you can do whatever you want with it. It's a new house, so there's not a lot going wrong yet. Um, and for me, just mentally, it's really helped because renting, like, you just that pressure of like, oh, you have people, like, we lived in a condo, right? So people above, people below, and you're making noise, might be bugging them, and maybe I don't know, like in Vancouver, I used to live in like basement suites, so people's homes, and you get evicted sometimes, not because I did something bad, but they're renovating and you get kicked out, or they're trying to raise your rent, and it just feels you don't have control over your life. And I'm one of those people who feel safer the more stuff I have to control, even if it's more work. So housing definitely has been a good thing. So if you were in a position like me, I'd say, yeah, housing, definitely do it. If you can own long term in Japan, I think it's good. But the one thing I would say, it's not an investment necessarily. Housing values, the actual structure will go down a lot in Japan. The price of the land, unless you're really in the core of Tokyo, it'll probably be going down because the population is declining. So, especially when you get outside of Tokyo, outside of any of the major cities, it'll be going down. So you have to kind of calculate it differently than what the money you'd pay for a property in a different country or a different city. All right, so Christian Marks, the difference between Japanese police and ambulance in comparison to another countries. Well, I can only really talk to Canada. So with police in general, I find Japanese police are friendlier. I don't kind of remember meeting a rude cop in Japan. In Canada, most of the cops I've met, really good interactions with them, but I've had a few where you feel a little more intimidated by Canadian cops, whether they're just physically bigger or just maybe their attitudes more like direct and straight to the point, or more like questioning. Japanese police I met sometimes like, oh, sorry to bother you, blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of my little anecdote for that. I haven't really gone to any big trouble in either country, so yeah. I haven't had any really negative confrontations with police in either country. One thing else that's different is in Japan, they have these little community police stations called kobans. And in Canada, we do have that as well, but they're really all over the place, I find, in Japan. So I kind of feel their presence a little bit more in Japan than I did in Canada. Now, for ambulances, I'll just say one thing is that in Canada, when you have an ambulance go by, you're supposed to pull on the side of the road and let the ambulance go by, and it'll like quickly zoom by. So the speed of Canadian ambulances is a lot higher than in Japan. Because Japanese ambulances, I would have figured that Japanese people would be a lot more um, would follow the rules a lot better in terms of pulling over on the side of the road, which you're supposed to do in Japan as well. But they don't seem to do it as much, and ambulances go slower, and they're a lot more cautious in Japan. So I thought that kind of surprising. Okay, Mrs. Paprika. I'd love to know your thoughts on small talk. When my husband and I go to Japan, he loves that he doesn't have to make small talk with cashiers or anyone in lines, but I miss it and often compliment people on various things as a way to strike up conversation. Do you enjoy small talk or prefer more to keep to yourself? I definitely prefer to keep to myself more. So in Tokyo, this kind of situation works better for me than in the rural parts of Japan. Because in Tokyo, people generally keep to themselves a lot more than if you're in the countryside. Um, yeah. Now now that I'm learning more Japanese or being able to better communicate in Japanese, I don't mind the small talk as much. It's less intimidating to me. So when I go to rural areas, it's kind of nice sometimes to chit chat a little bit. Yeah, I'm not like antisocial. Just um, I'm kind of more of an introvert than say an extrovert. Let's put it that way. Okay, Amber LHC. Even though your kids have another option on studying in Canada, do they still need to attend the after school tutorial classes like normal Japanese kids do? Do they feel pressure about the education system? They technically don't need to go to Juku, which is like the cram school or after school tutorials. Um, Now, and because of the age of my kids, I don't think there is much pressure. Some kids go, some kids don't. It doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Now Shin he does do juku once a week, and he does it for a little bit over an hour. But it's because he likes doing it, not for any other reason than that. So he enjoys doing it. So hey, let him go do it. Um, Now my feeling from looking at my nieces and nephews and looking at other like kids similar age that we know that are friends, it does. I would say there's more pressure in Japan overall to do those types of tutorials. Like, I guess they're cram schools, right? So they're actually, it's not like necessarily one on one tutorials, but might be like three on one, or there might be like all these little booths where people can study, and you have one or two or three kind of like instructors that go by and help them with various things. That just seems to be a lot more popular in Japan than in Canada, and it feels like there's more pressure. Like in Canada, I think the average family, the average parents, their view of education is kind of more rounded or more holistic. Like grades are not the only thing, are not the most important thing. There's a lot of other things you can learn in school and in life to succeed. So yeah. All right. Your senpai. Do you see yourself living in rural Japan after your kids start working? I would say no, and that's just because we already have our roots down with a house, but also we have family that live close by, so we enjoy that. And there's a lot of amenities living in the big city that are nice. That being said, if I had the opportunity to go to a rural area with the family for, say, like a month or two, or for a certain limited amount of time, and wouldn't cause too many hassles to do so, then I'd be definitely open to it. I kind of like changing the pace of life, going to the countryside, and there's different activities you can do, and I think it'd be a nice experience for the whole family. All right, last question by Chicky Maple. What's socially acceptable in Japan, and or what's not socially acceptable? And I just had, there's lots of things to talk about, but I just wanted to talk about one. And let's say just talk about smoking a little bit. So, smoking in certain areas, you cannot smoke outside in Japan. So, it really depends on the city that you're in, right? They have different rules. Each city has a different rule. And some of them you can't smoke while walking, but there are special spots you can smoke. But in most restaurants, you can smoke, or in cafes, you can smoke. So it's kind of maybe a bit the opposite of in Canada, where you can smoke outside as long as you're not at a park or you're not within a certain distance of a building entrance. You're allowed to smoke. But inside, it's pretty much banned all across Canada. It depends on your province and sometimes your city, but in general, that's the way it is in Canada. Um, Another little difference about smoking is in Canada, I don't know how much more we do it because I think the smoking levels are getting really low, but you can just flick your cigarette on the street and put it out. That's, I think, socially acceptable. Although now, I don't know, my mind, it's been a while since I've been in Canada for a good chunk of time. And if I saw someone do that, I'm so used to the way Japanese do it, which is they generally put it into an ashtray, or they have this little, like, thing that's kind of the size of your phone, and where they kind of like butt it out in here and collect the ashes. So they kind of don't leave their cigarettes everywhere. If you're in a nightclub type of area, they might do that, but I think for most parts, you don't see a lot of cigarette butts kicking around. So yeah, okay, lots of good questions, everyone. Thank you so much for asking them. I'll be back next month for some more Q&A. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Cheers.